So my dad was a great public speaker. I, not so much. So I'll do my best. Here it goes. The downside of being fortunate enough to make it to the age of 92 is that you often end up outliving most of your peers. So it's quite heartening to see that despite a paucity of contemporaries, how many of us are here today to honor and remember my father, Dr. Hans-Bertold Dietz. It is truly a fitting testimony to the enduring influence he has had on us all. Hans-Bertold Dietz. What a great name. A complex name. He's not just Hans-Bertold, but Hans-Bertold with a hyphen. As a kid, I always wondered what that meant. Did he have a middle name? Or was it two first names, or perhaps one long name? Either way, I've come to the conclusion that it was a fitting name for a man who, by virtue of his complex nature, is not easy to define. To his students, he was Dr. Dietz. His colleagues knew him as Bert. To our German relatives, Bertel. I remember in Europe he was often addressed as Herr Professor Doctor. He even could be identified by his moniker, HBD. After his retirement, he became Hans to his friends and Opa to his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But to me and my sisters, he was and will always be Dad. There's a lot we know and a lot we don't know about our dad's life. And now that he is gone, we can no longer ask him all the things we wish we could. We have had to become history detectives, searching his file drawers, trying to piece it all together. And amazingly, it's all there. Manila folders full of carefully ordered documents containing his curriculum vitae, articles, references in Who's Who, and numerous accolades and awards, letters, photos, films, and recordings, filling in and rounding out a picture of him we just peripherally knew. He was a student of music, history, an organist, composer, writer, professor, advisor, researcher, filmmaker, and private pilot. A man who has survived the horrors of World War II, immigrated to the United States, and came to truly believe in and then live the American dream. That being said, even armed with all this information, I still don't feel that I can speak with much authority about the specifics of his academic career. What I can do, however, is relay some of the stories he's told us over the years and share some personal memories of the experiences we had growing up with such a dynamic and driven man. Our dad was born and grew up in Dresden, Germany, the youngest of three brothers. He managed to live well during the Great Depression, in large part due to the entrepreneurial skill and resourcefulness of their father, Albert Dietz. They owned a large townhouse with the family business located on the ground floor, and also had a weekend cottage in the foothills outside the city. He was a sensitive child who showed an early interest in music. He always liked to tell the story about how his teacher commented on his name when he introduced himself on that first day of class. After hearing the name, the professor paused and then remarked, "Dietz? Das ist ein unmusikalischer Name." An unmusical name. A disparaging beginning to a career that, despite the having finished school for the day, he said he debated whether to stay in the city and join the family at their cottage in Mopschatz. So, with what amounts to the flip of a coin, he decided to take whichever car came first. The streetcar to Mopschatz was the first to arrive, so he left town to spend the weekend in the hills. Fate was on his side because that night Dresden was firebombed by the Allies. The aerial bombardment carried out by over 1,000 British and American aircraft lasted 3 days. Their townhouse was destroyed along with most of the city. One of the few things that made it through the war and is still in our possession is the family piano. A baby grand Perzina, smuggled out of the East, hidden on a train car under a load of lumber. After Frankfurt, where he met our mother while she was studying at the Mozarteum in Salzburg. In Dad's version of the story, he claims he wasn't planning on getting married right away. But when Julie brought him home to meet the parents, he discovered, unbeknownst to him, that an engagement announcement had already been printed in the local paper. Social norms being what they were at the time simply would not allow for an unwed couple to cohabitate. I know that his intentions were always honorable and that he was indeed in love and that he wholeheartedly embraced their small-town Midwestern life in the 50s. His brother-in-law ran the family business, and being family now, Dad was given a seat on the board of directors at the rubber factory, a position he held for many years and took quite seriously. While on the board, he always championed the workers and urged its members to consider more than just the bottom line. I believe his politics, shaped by the experience of growing up under the authoritarian rule of fascism, guided his opinions on the board and made him at times a thorn in the side of the more conservative-minded members. But he never shied away from a challenge and had a way of being respected for it. During the years he spent in Goshen, above and beyond pursuing his academic career, he became interested in movie making and flying. Frances Latta, his mother-in-law, had a small movie camera which she used to record her travels. She also had some editing equipment in the basement, and Dad offered to take on the job of cutting together her footage. And thus was born a lifelong love affair with filmmaking. Film's ability to juxtapose visuals with music made it his perfect medium. He quickly purchased his own 8mm equipment and began creating his own films. He called them HBD Tone Productions. One of his first was called The Love of Flying, a film which, complete with lots of aerial photography, documented his journey towards earning a private pilot's license. The whole series of other films soon followed, on topics exploring the historic church organs of Germany, the joy of Baroque architecture in Austria, and even the history of erotic art in a film titled The Case of the Venturesome Venus. It's the one film he would only show after his kids were in bed. At one point, he was even approached by an educational production company interested in having him write and produce similar films. He struggled with the idea and eventually turned the offer down over concerns that the business of filmmaking would compromise his personal vision, the thing that gave him the most creative pleasure. In retirement, he continued to create short films, now called emeritus productions, exploring topics of both artistic and personal nature. But as a family, we are especially fortunate to have all the home movies he made. They are the stories of our childhood told through the well-crafted lens of his romantic vision of life. They're so indelibly etched in my mind that I can no longer separate those movies from my own memories. But then again, why should I? They're such a gift, and to this day, my preferred way of remembering our past. In 1963, having been hired by the University of Texas, Dad moved us from Indiana to the hills west of Austin, where we began to explore our new surroundings. As kids, we had free rein of hills and creeks and roamed unimpeded around the area. The three of us would often walk the length of Westlake Drive to the Stop and Go, pick up discarded pop bottles along the way, cash them in at the store, buy some candy, and head back home. When we told Dad what we had done that day, he took that material and at bedtime turned it into a story. The Adventures in Pop Bottle Land became a nightly serial complete with cliffhangers that always left us wanting more. The delight he took in telling us these stories speaks to the greater truth of his nature. Storytelling permeated everything he did, whether it was as a teacher, filmmaker, writer, or composer. He was always telling a story. And it was his way of engaging you, entertaining you, and then enlightening you. Dad loved to take the family car on weekend excursions into the hill country. We would sightsee and picnic our way around central Texas. Inevitably, we would end up careening down one of the many narrow and often quite steep jeep trails that wound through the hills. We dubbed them Fati roads, our father's roads. And they both thrilled and terrified us. Our trepidation while hanging precariously close to the edge was always tempered by his steady hand at the wheel. We knew we were secure in his hands, and we always have been. What more could you want from a parent? As a pilot, he displayed the same steady hand at the controls. He truly loved flying. In the air, he was in complete control. And in that, I believe he found freedom. For us, the long hours crammed together in the backseat of that little Cessna, the constant prop noise, clear air turbulence, and pressure on the ears, not to mention the occasional bouts of air sickness, gave us mixed feelings about flying. But the places he took us and the perspective it afforded, looking down on the earth from above, were unique experiences I cherish to this day. I remember one time in particular flying back to Austin, watching the sunset, getting antsy because we weren't home yet and it was getting dark. Sensing our restlessness, Dad turned to the three of us and asked, "Want to see the sunset again?" And then proceeded to take the plane up, gaining altitude until, sure enough, the sun slowly rose. And then after the plane leveled off, it set again. A magical moment. One of many we experienced with him at the helm. Our dad could also be an imposing figure, a force of nature, who at times we found a bit intimidating. He had a study at the end of a long, dark hallway. It was his inner sanctum. Classical music, tantalizing yet incomprehensible, drifting out from within. It was a place we approached with caution and deference, never wanting to disturb the master at work. The walls of books and records in there were impressive yet mysterious, many of the books written in German and all those records with numbers in their titles. Of course, if you knew just where to look, there was a small section where he kept the comedy and the musicals and the movie soundtrack albums, which we found a more approachable affair. At Sunday dinner, he would always have a record selection ready to play. Never the professor would ask us to name that composer. I usually kept my head down, hoping the question was just rhetorical. My little sister's strategy, on the other hand, was to always just say Mozart. And on occasion, she got it right. And those records, and eventually much of the classical music he exposed us to, although intimidating at first, has become, with knowledge and experience, the soundtrack to our lives. In 1968, he packed up the entire family and headed off to Europe, by ocean liner no less, complete with steamer trunks and the family cat. He had received a 2-year grant to live and work in Europe, first as a guest lecturer at the University of Freiburg in Germany, and then in a longer-term position as guest professor at the University of Innsbruck in Austria. Those years we spent in Europe were hands down the most formative time of our young lives. We made our home in Innsbruck and were dropped into the local schools with only the vaguest understanding of the German language. But when you're young, it doesn't take too long to catch on. We traveled across Germany, Austria, and Italy as he made his way from library to library, doing research on several 18th century Neapolitan composers. The places he took us, the art and architecture he exposed us to, and the way he enhanced those experiences with his command of history gave us a worldview that to this day still shapes our lives. We've had several opportunities since then to travel abroad together, and I have to tell you, there's no better tour guide to be had than our father. And it wasn't until I was a student at UT myself that I really came to understand and appreciate Dad's skill as a teacher. As my schedule allowed, I would sit in on his 302L class and marvel at his command of the stage in those 300-plus seat lecture halls. I would go on to catch his class whenever I could for the remainder of my college career, and to my amazement, it was never the same twice. That was the true depth of his dedication. Almost without fail, he would rework the class, try different approaches, use different pieces of music, all in an attempt to distill the musical experience to its essence, doing it as much for himself as for his students. Several years after his divorce, he met and married Marley, a young, gifted concert pianist. That 37-year romance was, without a doubt, the happiest time of his life. He was on top of his game academically and traveled Europe extensively with her at his side as he continued to research his beloved Neapolitan composers. In all the photos I've seen of him during those years, he always looked relaxed, cheerful, and most of all, contented. As I began to make my own way in life, working and then raising a family back in Indiana, my interactions necessarily became less frequent. And as time would allow, sometimes only once or twice a year, I'd fly down and visit, even if for just a long weekend. With the time I had, I loved nothing more than to sit at the table and talk for hours about anything and everything. Having become a filmmaker myself, we especially enjoyed watching movies together and discussing the art and craft of filmmaking. Of course, in our debates, he could be quite critical if he wanted to, taking delight in playing the role of devil's advocate, forcing me to defend my positions. As exasperating as that could be at times, the criticism was always constructive, and the process inevitably led me to a greater understanding of my own beliefs and opinions. By the year 2000, after almost 40 years of teaching, Dad finally retired from the university, only to begin a second career teaching an adult class called How to Listen to Classical Music through the Lifetime Learning Institute, where he cultivated a loyal following of students, many becoming good friends in the process. It was a gig that lasted another 15 years. We always thought that this was how he would live out the rest of his days, with Marley at his side, but life is unpredictable, and this did not come to pass. After a 7-year struggle, Marley lost her battle with cancer, leaving Dad alone with a grief he could never entirely overcome. For the last 6 years of his life, health issues started to take their toll as well, especially his eyesight, and having to give up driving was the first step on his path towards isolation. He had briefly flirted with the idea of going into an independent living facility, only to back out at the last minute. Even though we told him that wherever he went, he would undoubtedly become the rock star of the place, complete with his own entourage of groupies. But that was the paradox of his personality. He could be disarmingly charming and witty, and yet shy away from social settings unless he could dictate the terms. I believe that even in the depth of his isolation, his sense of autonomy was the more powerful force. As his macular degeneration progressed, reading, writing, and then even using technology became increasingly difficult. And then the pandemic hit. I was unable to visit for an entire year until he and I both got vaccinated. It's hard to imagine what form of isolation that must have been like. The saving grace was that he could still play the piano. It became the lifeline to his sanity. He practiced religiously every day and spent much time creating and honing his musical compositions. He truly loved where he was, the house in the hills, the grand piano in the living room. He loved the view from his seat at the table, the trees who've grown and the surrounding hills filled with fancy houses over the last 58 years. But the view across the valley to Mount Bonnell has remained remarkably immutable. I'm truly glad that he never had to leave his home, and that he had good friends and neighbors who cared about him, delivered groceries, took him into their homes, and made him part of their families. All three of us are profoundly grateful for that. And now that he is gone, even though he has left a wealth of material we can still access, it is the memories we have that I will treasure the most. Dad was quite nostalgic and loved to reminisce, and though we would roll our eyes whenever he started in again on a story we had heard 100 times, I now realize that the constant repetition was his way of ensuring that they would be remembered. So I would like to end with one last anecdote relayed to me recently by my nephew Peter Allen. He, as the only grandson to become a trained musician and composer, shared a special relationship with his opa. It was on Dad's birthday, just weeks before his death, that Peter told him the story of how he had met and chatted with a young student studying classical saxophone at UT. Peter noted that his grandfather used to be a music professor at UT, and maybe he'd heard of him, Dr. Dietz. The young man couldn't believe it. You're Dr. Dietz's grandson? My God, you have no idea. Dr. Dietz, the man's a legend in the department. If it seems hard to believe that after more than 20 years in retirement, our father's reputation in the department has not faded, we found the answer to that question in a trove of letters in a folder in one of his file drawers, aptly titled Fan Mail. 1965 to 2000. A couple of which my sister Barbara would like to share with you now.
Well, I have so much I would be able to say about my father, but he was an intimidating person, like Chris said, and he and I shared a deep love. You know, we got each other, we understood each other, but we didn't have the language to communicate that, and I also just got to have that in these last few years. And I never could talk about my dad in public because I would cry, but I can read other people's words. So this is just a small sampling and just parts of them. I do want to be a better musicologist. This was a dissertation student. You are my hero, you know. I see in you that it is possible to be a great teacher and a great musicologist. I learned so much from you. I truly could not find a greater mentor than you. You mean the world to me. Dr. Dietz, I just think you ought to know what an impact your teaching has had on me. I have thoroughly enjoyed every minute of this music class, as well as your fine arts class last spring. You are without a doubt the best professor I've ever had the privilege of learning from.